quality over cost. So we're going to move on now. So quality over cost, way of describing it in the NHS. Now, there are three domains of quality. There are clinical outcomes, and it's important to note that there's no specific clinical outcome that you have to meet. It could be length of stay, it could be complications, it could be mortality, could be any of the kind of markers of outcomes that you might be able to find. And the key thing is you find the most appropriate one for whatever you're measuring. So, and unfortunately, a lot of my my examples and anecdotes will be from my own experience, so anaesthetic or surgical. So, apologise for those of you in the community of mental health. I'll try and come up with some over the next few as we go along. But for example, one of my surgical colleagues, they do a different way of closing the abdomen after a big laparotomy, so a big cut in the abdomen, and it takes half an hour longer. But it doesn't affect the length of stay. It doesn't affect 28-day mortality or any immediate outcomes. It doesn't affect anything in the first 12 months. Okay, there's no difference, but it takes longer. You go, well, so under the traditional metrics that you'd measure, it wouldn't really matter. But over 10 years or so, it reduces the rate of getting a hernia in that wound, so an incisional hernia, by about 70%. Now, incisional hernias are a massive burden in terms of when they do occur, they often require overnight stays. They're not day case operations, and they can cause complications like bowel obstruction and all that kind of stuff. So it is a significant thing to save. So it is worth it for the extra half an hour. But you have to do a much bigger study to show that, rather than using the traditional metrics. So it's just an example of how choosing the right outcome measure can affect what your study shows, or what your service improvement project is designed to do. The other two are patient experience and patient safety. Now, there are two ways of looking at this equation. When you are looking at justifying your business case or service improvement project, you have to show that there has to be an increase in quality, and you have to show that increase in quality is worth the cost. Okay. So in order to add value, you need to increase quality, and it has to be worth the cost. So you can, in theory, we could rebuild every hospital in the UK, in the NHS. Okay. And it will improve quality overall, but in some places, rebuilding the hospital won't be worth, or the increase in quality won't be worth the cost. In some place it will, but it doesn't. You have to be able to justify it. It has to justify that cost. The other way of looking at it is that increasing quality will always reduce costs. The problem is, it may not be the cost to you. It may not be the cost to your department. It may not be the cost to your organization. It may be benefits to primary care. It might be benefits to the community sector. It might be benefits to the, or if it's a primary care initiative, it might be benefits to secondary care. Or it might be societal benefits. And that's what Michael Porter was talking about. He's a Harvard business economist, and came up with this concept. Now, costs are divided into revenue and capital costs. Now, revenue are day-to-day spending costs. They recur. So if you incur a cost that is a revenue cost will continue for many years. Every year that will occur. Capital costs are your one-off big purchases, and they're non-recurring. Okay, so that's how you define revenue and capital costs. And as I said, there are other costs like environmental costs, societal costs, which traditionally we've never factored in when we're looking at value and costs, but we're trying to start to build in that now. Okay, so we can talk a little bit about the structure of the NHS now. So you've got the NHS from 1948 to 2024, it's had various evolutions. So the NHS, when it was created, was never a planned system. It basically nationalised the existing healthcare that was around at the time. And it meant that there were pockets, so particularly around the big urban areas, there were pockets of healthcare, but it wasn't planned and it wasn't very structured. So in 1962, they decided to try and build a district general hospital for every 125,000 of the population. They started it and they ran out of money. And finances have been a limiting factor to the NHS across the whole of its existence. Even in 1948, it overspent. In 1974, you have this kind of, they're trying to plan healthcare a bit more with the development of health authorities. In 1990, they came up with this concept of the internal market where organizations would compete against each other for services. And the idea was that the competition would increase quality and also reduce costs. And it worked briefly when money was not a limiting factor, during the boom period. It seemed to work because you could decide factors on quality. But when money becomes a limiting factor, then what was tending to happen is that the service that was chosen or the provider that was chosen was often the cheapest. And whilst they said they would provide improvements in quality, they often couldn't do that. And they had the NHS plan in 2000, and then the last big reforms, major complicated reforms, were the Health and Care Act in 2012. Now, they were instigated, or they were developed, and the idea was conceived by the opposition, by the Conservative Party when they were in the opposition, before they came into power. And during that time, while they were being conceived, they had the financial crisis. So by the time they came into power and the actual reforms were enacted, the world economics and the landscape had changed quite significantly. And then another thing that's common in the NHS is that the concept worked in theory, but it didn't seem to land when it was implemented. So there were issues in how it was implemented. And so what's happened in the 10 years between the 2012 reforms is the NHS has tried to maneuver itself within the legal framework that was created by the reforms then. So that created a number of different organizations and a number of different structures, and it had a duty to compete. So all services, when they were being commissioned, had to be put out for tender. And it was apparent that, again, the method by which these services were chosen were not always the most transparent, and often it was through to the lowest, whoever was going to offer it for the lowest price. And so in 2019, the NHS England put forward some ideas to help change the legal framework to adapt it to how the situation was, and to help improve things for the future. And that's what happened for the 2022 Health and Care Act. And I'll come across to some of the changes that happened there in a bit. So the money that the Health Department of Health gets is determined by Parliament. Now, health is a devolved entity issue. So when we talk about a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about is specific to England. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, their governments determine how much money goes to health based on their grant and any income they generate themselves. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'll say is that whilst it's called the Department of Health and Social Care, social care is funded by the local authorities. And the Department of Social Care has some remit for that, but doesn't really. So in order to get, again, just to try and ask the question, to get a kind of an idea
You've been muted, just to let you know.
Can you hear me again now? Is that better? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's try this again. So if you can rank in order the budgets of the departments of health and education and defence, so you can just see how it compares to each other. And who do you think's got the most? Who do you think's got the least? Okay. Let's see. Oh, a couple more people. Give another 10 seconds and then we'll go on. Okay. Yeah, everybody always thinks defense, the Ministry of Defence gets a lot more. So we're actually quite a lot wrong, actually. So if we look at these are the annual budgets for the Department of Health, Education and the Ministry of Defence. So health is just shy of 200 billion pounds. So this is billion with a B, pounds. Education is in the 85 to 90 billion pounds, and Department of Defence, Ministry of Defence is just over 50 billion pounds. Now, the thing that people often ask me is that what about Trident? What about the aircraft carriers we'll keep building? They are kind of, that cost is spread out over 10, 15 years. So we never pay upfront for a aircraft carrier or the Trident missile system. That's spread over multiple years. So that's why the Ministry of Defence actually has relatively low budget annually. And we are cutting the armed forces, kind of the regular permanent armed forces, massively over the last 10, 15 years as well. And then this is a report that came out last Tuesday, actually, from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. So based on our spending plans, we are currently spending 43% of all public spending, of day-to-day public spending, so your revenue public spending, is spent on health. And whilst we know that health funding is probably there's not enough of it, there are only two ways of kind of increasing health spending. You have to either cut spending from other areas, or you've got to increase the bank balance of the Treasury. That means by economic productivity growth. So it's going to be tough for whoever is in government in the next few years. And if we look at the detail of how the Department of Health and Social Care is funded, the grey at the end, so this is how it's changed over the last few years. The grey at the end is the capital funding. You can see the majority of funding goes to the NHS England. So it goes in from the Department of Health and Social Care to NHS England. And what has happened this year, or last year, and was happening previously pre-COVID, was that if there's overspend in the revenue budget, day-to-day capital budget, so by the providers, they often have to take money out of the capital budgets to plug the gap, because the Department of Health and Social Care has to break even. They are statutory, legally obliged to break even. They're not allowed to go over. So they often keep some money in reserve, but also they often take money out of the capital funding pot, which is why we're struggling to get any of the big capital projects and the maintenance backlogs sorted, is because if we overspend on our revenue, it comes out of the capital budgets. The other thing is that the Department of Health and Social Care, that's the blue bit, that's for its own expenses and the other bodies that it funds that are not the NHS England. And we'll talk about those in a second. And then the final bit I would say is that when governments, of whichever denomination, say that they are protecting the budget of the NHS, they are protecting NHS England's budget. And it often means that the Department of Health and Social Care has cuts. So they cut the budget of the Department of Social Care, but they protect the amount of it that goes to NHS England. Okay, and that's caused issues in the past. So from that little blue box, which is a small proportion of the total funding, the Department of Health and Social Care has to fund several other bodies. How many can we name? Okay, you've got NICE, that's good. Public Health England doesn't exist anymore per se. It's called something else now. Yeah, it's called the UK Health Security Agency. So some of these bodies are funded, have a UK-wide remit. Others don't. Others have a much smaller remit. We have the CQC. Yep. I'm coming thick and fast now. So CQC, yes. MHRA, the Medical Healthcare Regulatory Agency, yes. The Health and Safety Executive, no, that's that goes across bodies, so that's not funded by Department of Health and Social Care, because that has that's health and safety at work. It comes under a different area. Health research, not directly, that has funding from different pots. But there is another one that kind of comes from that. So primary care networks are funded by NHS England. CQC, yes. CCGs don't exist anymore. We'll talk about that in a second. Not sure about NHS Futures. It's not one of the list on the list. Health Education England, I will talk about in a second. NHSI, again, I'll talk about in a second, doesn't exist. Social care is not funded by Department of Health and Social Care. It's funded by local authorities. ICBs are funded by NHS England. HSIB, yes. Oh, I'll stop there. Okay. So you've got the Medicines and Healthcare Products, a regulatory agency, MHRA, which approves vaccines, improves any drugs, and improves any kind of healthcare products that you're using, devices. It has to go through the MHRA. The one you probably heard of or more of is the FDA, which is the American version. That comes into the news more. And then you've got the UK Health Security Agency, which was previously known as Public Health England. So public health is an odd way. It's funded in an odd way, in that the Department of Health and Social Care funds the Health Security Agency, which has a UK-wide remit, but the public health itself sits within the local authority. So the money then goes into local authorities for local public health initiatives. And then, because some public health initiatives are screening programs and vaccination programs, that money comes back into the NHS. Some of that money comes back into the NHS. So it goes in a kind of an odd way round. You've got the special health authorities, you've got NHS Blood and Transplant, you've got who deal with blood and transplant issues, so blood banks and stuff like that. The Business Service Authorities, which deals with pensions and prescription charges. NHS Resolution, which is well, it's relatively new name of for the litigation authority. So they deal with patient safety. They administer the clinical negligence scheme for trusts, which is the kind of the insurance against litigation that the organisations have, and that has a pot. So this is the last time I properly looked into it was about 6 or 6 years ago. But the annual payout to the pool that the organisations have to fund for litigation is in the region of £2 billion a year. So that's how much money that has to be sits in that pool. And these are often for historical issues that have ranged from 10 to 20 years ago, potentially. And often litigation issues and often take 5 or 6 years to come to be determined. So any money that's being paid out now, even if it's a one-off, was from at least 5 or 6 years ago, if not more. Whether the blood scandal issues will be paid out of that pot, or whether it'll be a separate national pot for that, I don't know. And then you've got the Counter Fraud Authority, to try and combat fraud in the NHS. And then you've got these are the way it's been divided, the official designations, but they're all essentially they all are funded by Department of Health Social Care. The way they've been divided up is just in terms of how much accountability control the Department of Health Social Care have. So executive agencies are under direct control, special health authorities are slightly more at arm's length, and then the executive non-departmental public bodies are much more arm's length. They get given a mandate, and they are just funded rather than controlled by Department of Health and Social Care. So you've got NHS England, you've got the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence. So health education and NHS Digital used to be arm's length bodies, but they no longer exist as of 2023. April 2023, they got absorbed into NHS England. Then you got your regulators, the CQC, and then you've got some more niche ones, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, the Human Tissue Authority, the Health Research Authority, and then the Health Services Safety Investigations Body, which just became a statutory body last year, and is accountable to Parliament, but is funded by the Department of Health and Social Care. So they are 12 bodies that are funded from that little blue bit. So excluding NHS England, all the rest are funded from that little blue bit. Okay. NHS England funds then the integrated care systems, who then fund the organisations that provide your patient care, NHS providers. NHS England does do some of its own commissioning, directly commissioned services, but that will be shown in this. Now, I have a feeling I'm going to stop sharing because I don't think I've shared sound. So give me 1 second. Apologies.
This animation gives an overview of the structure of the NHS in England and describes how the money flows. How public money is spent is determined by Parliament, and more specifically, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Money allocated to healthcare is determined by the Spending Review, which is usually every 3 years, and amended annually by the Budget Report. The government department responsible for healthcare is the Department of Health and Social Care, which has the largest amount of pre-allocated public money, with an annual budget for 2023 to 24 of £188 billion. This is divided into £176 billion of revenue funding to cover day-to-day running costs, such as staff salaries and medicines, and £12 billion of capital funding to pay for infrastructure and maintenance costs. Health is a devolved function, so this funding is only for healthcare in England, as social care is funded separately via local authorities. From the budget, the Department of Health and Social Care has to pay its internal costs and fund several executive agencies, special health authorities and arm's-length bodies. The biggest of which is NHS England, which legally merged with NHS Improvement on the 1st of July 2022 as part of the Health and Care Bill. NHS England has now also merged with NHS Digital and Health Education England. NHS England received the majority of the Department of Health budget, with funding for 2023 to 24 of £160 billion. NHS England works via 7 regional teams to support the delivery of the NHS long-term plan. The plan was published in 2019 and outlines the key ambitions for the health service for the next 10 years, to create a service fit for the future and get the most value for patients out of every taxpayer pound. The Health and Care Bill builds on the long-term plan to support integration. NHS England has a budget of £27 billion for directly commissioning services, including some primary care services and public health. It directly commissions military healthcare, health services in the justice system, for healthcare for children, young people and adults across secure and detained settings, and specialised services. There are 154 directly commissioned specialised services, which are grouped into 6 programmes of care: internal medicine, cancer care, the trauma programme, women and children, blood and infection services, and mental health. Over the next few years, NHS England will delegate some of its commissioning responsibilities to local commissioners, with pharmacy, ophthalmology and dentistry services fully delegated by 2023. 9 regional committees are being created to commission specialised services from April 2023. They are joint committees between NHS England and the relevant integrated care systems in
We've lost sound. I think now you're muted.
Published on a statutory basis on the 1st of July 2022 as part of the Health and Care Bill. Integrated care systems have 4 main purposes. They bring partner organisations together to improve outcomes in population health and healthcare, tackle inequalities in outcomes, experience and access, enhance productivity and value for money, help the NHS support broader social and economic development. The new ICS are led by an Integrated Care Board, ICB, and an Integrated Care Partnership, ICP. The exact composition of both the ICB and ICP will vary between areas, but as a minimum, the Integrated Care Board will include a chair, the CEO, and representatives from NHS providers, general practice, and local authorities. ICBs replaced clinical commissioning groups, CCGs, and are now responsible for developing a plan for meeting the population's health needs, managing the NHS budget, and arranging for the provision of health services in the integrated care system. The majority of NHS England's budget, £107.8 billion, is allocated to ICBs for commissioning local health services. ICBs plan and commission services for their patients. The Integrated Care Partnership will also include the ICB CEO, local authority representatives and NHS providers, but may also include representation from other organisations. The Health and Care Act has seen a shift to more strategic commissioning and a more collaborative approach to planning care. allocations are made from NHS England to ICBs as a system funding envelope. ICBs will have the flexibility to manage resources within this envelope to deliver agreed local priorities. ICBs will agree on contracts with providers, with increases expected to be based on aligned payments and incentive basis. Organisations within ICSs have to adopt and adhere to a shared control total, which in effect binds them to meeting a collective target for financial performance. So, in summary, money flows from Parliament via the Department of Health to NHS England and, in the most part, integrated care boards to the organisations that provide patient care.
Okay. So the Health and Care Act 2022, so it was based on some recommendations made by an 100. There were 130 different bits to it. I'm going to talk about the ones that relate to the NHS structure and the finances around it. As the animation suggested, the first thing was just making the statutory bodies of integrated care boards and the integrated health and care partnerships. They replace CCGs, and that's because when the CCGs were first designed, there were 200 and something of them, and whilst again the concept was probably sound, I think the logistical nightmare of trying to commission on the basis of 200 different organization commissioning didn't work, and so quite quickly they started merging, and you were getting close to, or you were going to get close to the 42 that were going to end up as integrated care boards. So that's what you've ended up with, 42 integrated care boards. The health and care partnerships are an additional layer to that, in that they encompass some of the more social care organisations, such as housing associations, the police, third sector charities, and other voluntary organisations that might have a input into the social care side of things to help, ideally, to do more joined up care. So, as I said previously, there in the original 2012 reforms, there was a duty to compete. So there was an obligation, a requirement that when commissioners were putting services out, they had to put it out for tender. Now there isn't, that duty has been removed, and there's a duty now to collaborate. So you are obliged to work with your partner organisations, and you can be punished if you are deemed to be difficult or not collaborating. It also opens a way for more joint appointments and joint committees. So whilst there may have been some joint appointments and committees, they were going through legal loopholes rather than official ones. And so now you're much more able to do these joint appointments and committees. And this duty to collaborate hasn't removed the option of putting things out to tender. It just removes that obligation. So if a commissioner, the commissioning body, wants to put a service out to tender, they can, but normally that's in collaboration with the provider networks, so that it kind of works up in this joined up way. The other big thing is all about how the accountability worked. So we had the NHS England, which was the commissioning body. They were the main kind of commissioners, in that they delegated down their commissioning responsibilities to the CCGs and now the ICBs. But your financial and main regulator for the organisations were, you probably know them mostly as NHS Improvement, but legally there were two separate organisations. So legally, NHS Improvement never really existed. It was the Trust Development Authority and Monitor. And this harks back to a time when there was a real push to make organisations into foundation trusts, and so Monitor was set up to look after the foundation trusts, to give oversight to the foundation trusts, and the Trust Development Authority was there to help those that weren't foundation trusts to become foundation trusts. And the main kind of criteria to become a foundation trust was to be financially sustainable. And there were some organisations that cut a few corners in order to reach foundation trust status, and which meant they got a bit more autonomy. They got to be a bit more independent and less under the direct control of NHS England. But then they quite quickly, I wouldn't quite say crashed and burned, but they got into difficulties and needed intense support to get out of those financial issues. And so quite quickly they realised that actually it wasn't being a foundation trust wasn't the best end game, and so they stopped pushing organisations to become foundation trusts, and they merged Monitor and the Trust Development Authority to become NHS Improvement, and so you had the commissioning body, and then you had the regulator, and what was happening then was that they were sending mixed messages. So, for example, NHS England would say you need to have this number of staffing to provide safe staffing levels, and NHS Improvement was saying that you can't afford to have safe staffing levels. You've got to do it a different way. And so the organisations were having who to listen to, and they're having issues with that. So then they became NHS England and Improvement for a while, and then as part of these kind of new legal framework, there's just now one body called NHS England. So NHS Improvement doesn't exist anymore. It is just NHS England now. So that's how it's all been put together. And the final thing that's been added into these into this legislation was NHS England was very much at arm's length from the Department of Health and Social Care, in that Department of Health and Social Care would issue a mandate every year, every financial year, with some criteria of what they expected. But other than that, the NHS was left to get on with it. But as part of the new legislation, there's increased power and therefore accountability to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a couple of minutes to see if there's any questions before I go on to talk about payment systems. There will be a kind of formal Slido thing at the end. How much money is being wasted? Yes, it probably is quite a bit, but I don't know the exact numbers, but yes, there is a lot of reorganization. Some of it is to, as I said, the most recent changes were more of a tidy up of the legislation rather than anything else, anything major. But the 2012 reforms certainly were a big revamp that cost a lot of money. Yeah, very much so. Any other questions on the structure stuff? As I said, we'll talk about, there'll be a formal thing later on. What will the future deliver? Oh, who knows? I don't know what the future. There's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, primarily because of the upcoming elections, and the whichever way it goes, and to the degree of whichever way it swings, essentially. So it could go mostly in different ways, and I don't know what the government changes will do, because every government will have different priorities, there are different ways of funding. The ideas that the potential Labour government might have are not dissimilar from what the Conservative government are proposing, so it's not majorly different. And yes, the structures, there is some sort of a bit of a merry-go-round, and you had the strategic health authorities, which were the overseeing bodies, and then you got to CCGs, and now back to the bigger bodies again. So there is a bit of a kind of round circle. What I will say is that CCGs were led by primary care, in that they had the majority of the people on the CCG boards were GPs, with representation from the other kind of providers and other bodies. The ICBs are much more of a equally divided up. So you've got primary care networks have their contributing factors, or participants. You have the NHS providers, you have the whole breadth of the NHS providers, and then you get your local authorities, which weren't involved in commissioning before. So there is a slight change in terms of how the mix of people on these boards. It is just it's just how things are shifted, essentially. There is a push towards the change in social care, but until local authorities have better funding, or the NHS starts funding social care, I don't think we're going to get major changes in that way. Okay, so I'm going to go on to talk about payment systems. So payment systems of the NHS are continually changing. Nobody's come up with a clear payment system that is going to be the kind of be all and end all, the ultimate payment system. And unlike most other things in the NHS, this is something it's constantly evolving. So what I'm going to cover firstly are the building blocks. These are the ways in which in theory, a payment system could be devised. And these building blocks are the basis of any payment system in the world, are based on one of these principles, or a combination of these principles. Okay, and there are pros and cons to each one. So the first one is something called block contract. The block contract is the simplest form of payment system. It is a lump sum to provide a specific range of services. And it's, you can negotiate the actual amount based on historic values or historic data, but essentially you sign a contract, you determine the amount, that's it. It doesn't matter how much is delivered. So if you're commissioned to deliver 100 hip replacements, it doesn't matter if you deliver 90 or 110, you get paid the same. So it doesn't matter about the demand or what's delivered. One obviously has negative connotations for the provider, the other has negative connotations for the commissioner, in that somebody's lost in value. The benefit is that it's predictable. So the commissioner knows how much they're spending on a particular service, the provider knows how much they're getting. So when things are hard to measure or a bit unpredictable, then that's when a block contract is used. So it was used during the COVID pandemic for all contracts. It was based on an activity in December 2019. It was used in things like community services, where it's hard to measure active levels of activity. It has been used historically in the immediate pre-pandemic area, where finances were a bit of a mess, and a block contract meant that you could accurately balance the books. As I said, commissions could know how much they were going to get. The providers could, or the providers, whichever system, would know how much they were going to receive. So they have been used intermittently, particularly where there's either financial uncertainty, or there's an uncertainty in terms of delivery. Capitation is something where it's a per capita or per person payment, and it's how things like the ICBs get their funding via capitation. The health boards in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland get their funding via capitation, and GPs get the majority if they're on the standard GMS or the old school PMS contract, if it still exists. get their funding by this capitation method, and it's a weighted population. So it's how you then weight the population that's the most controversial bit. So it's how you factor in things like deprivation, burden, so people high users versus low users, age, various other factors, and what factors you do factor into your weighting of the population. And that's where the controversy generally lies. And things like that. So GP services, they use something called the Cahill formula, and there are other formulas for things like the ICBs and how they're funded. But essentially, it's you adjust the population based on various factors, but it's a weighted population, and you get a payment per person. Pathway of care is a single payment to cover a specific pathway of care. It was going to be this newfangled thing that was going to be a solution for lots of different things, but then it's kind of gone out of favor again. Currently, it might come back in the future, but it's basically a payment for a whole pathway, as I said. So the one it was being kind of mooted for or thought about was for things like defined pathways. So hip replacement. Again, you can do a payment for the whole pathway from referral through to optimization, prehabilitation, to the operation, to rehabilitation. Okay, and the benefit of it is you get a lead provider gets the payment, and they can then outsource the different parts of the pathway to different providers or provide them in house. But you get the commissioners provide a payment for the whole pathway. It was used in hospital maternity services, and you got a payment for antenatal, a payment for intrapartum, and a payment for postnatal care. And there were, high, low risk, medium risk, high risk for antenatal, and there were 5 for intrapartum and a few for postnatal. And the problem was that if you started off as a low risk pregnancy, but then you needed more scans or more consultations because you became more high risk, you didn't get a increase in your tariff payment until the intrapartum bit, your delivery bit. Okay, so you couldn't do any in pathway changes, and that's where the problems came. And so that's kind of why it went out of favour. So pay performance is a part of all the contracts in the NHS at the moment. In GP, it's the quality for outcomes framework, and that can be 20% of a GP's income. Primary care practices income, it can be from QOF payments. For the acute community mental health, its services is a much smaller amounts. It's kind of 1.225% currently, and you get it used to be 2.5%, but it's come down, and that's because the sequins were changing every year, and there were ongoing costs from delivering last year's sequins that weren't always being accounted for in the following year's sequin. So that's why it's kind of come down in value. And there are national and local sequins that you can sign up to. I think you get to choose to sign up to X number. Well, you have to sign up to X number, but there are a number of options you can choose from. Per diem is not used in the NHS very much, but it is being used in particularly in the developing world and other parts of the country, other parts of Europe. It's a lump sum payment per patient per day of care. You can get payments for things like, you can have a tariff-based thing where you have payment for level 0 care, level 1 care, level 2 care, level 3 care, or different intensities of care. But it's a lump sum per patient per day of care. The one that people know best in the acute sector is the case-based or activity-based payment system. It's had various names. It's had payment by results, it's had a national tariff, and it's currently, we've got the NHS payment system. This is based on the more work you do, the more you get paid. You adjust, you get 3 factors. You get your diagnoses, multiple diagnoses. You get any procedures you get undertaken, and then you get any comorbidities that the patients have. That goes into a software program. You get a healthcare resource group, and that's what the tariff is allocated to. Okay, and that's where your case-based activity comes in. Historically, the problems have been that when different providers are on different contracts, particularly if one's on a case-based system and the other one's on a block contract, it doesn't encourage collaboration, because the person, the block, the organisation, the block contract has no incentive to take on any extra work outside their contract, and the case-based activity-based organisation doesn't want to give away any work because they're losing income. The problem is, and the thing that we often forget, is that sometimes providing a service costs more than the money you're getting to provide that service, because it's inefficient, or we're not the best place to do it. And that's where cost versus price comes in. If we are losing money on every time we do a particular procedure, or the pathway is wrong, it's not that we say we shouldn't be doing it, it's just something in the pathway is wrong, which means that it's costing us too much, and we have to look at that in a bit more detail. And then finally, it's pass-through payments. So the cost of the delivery, how it costs to deliver that service, is paid for by the commissioning body. So, for example, high-cost chemotherapy drugs are done that in that way. So these are the 7 building blocks of a payment system. And as I said, these are the things that are used all across the world in different combinations. What we have at the moment is what's called the Aligned Payment Incentive Program payment system. And this is used for across the board. It's used for all contracts. And there are, it's a blended payment system, essentially. We used it last year and we're using it again this year. And essentially there's a fixed element which covers your agreed level of acute activity. Okay. So it covers, and this is across maternity, mental health, community and ambulance services. This is your kind of acute, your kind of fixed level of activity based on historic data, essentially. It also includes things like your expected, so BPT is your best practice tariff. So certain procedures, certain pathways have an enhanced tariff if you meet certain quality indicators. So, for example, the hip fracture pathway, now there's multiple different quality indicators you've got to reach. So if you hit, I think it's 75% of your patients meet all these quality indicators, you get an enhanced tariff across the board. And it's things like, there's various things involved in it. So you include that, your expectation to achieve that in your fixed element, and you get your the CNST is your clinical negligence scheme trust, that's your litigation kind of insurance payment, all included in your fixed element. So this should cover the majority of your fixed costs. Now, if you had just a fixed element or just a block contract, there's no incentive to do any elective activity or do any more activity. There's no incentive to bring down the waiting lists by doing X-ray work, essentially. And so there's a variable element which covers all elective care. So elective, ordinary and day case, outpatient procedures which have a NHS payment system unit price. So certain procedures that are performed in outpatients have a unit price. Outpatient first attendances, diagnostic imaging, nuclear medicine, and chemotherapy deliveries, all covered within the elective. So the more you do, the more money you get. Okay. And then the final variable element is if you don't achieve your best practice tariff or sequin, that money gets taken off. Okay. So this is for all contracts apart from those with a kind of value of less than £500,000, and that tends to be for out of area work. So for if we're in Leicester and somebody comes from Cornwall, generally people don't come to Leicester for very much, but people certainly don't come from Cornwall for very often. So our interaction will be less than £500,000. Therefore, we would have a low volume activity contract with them rather than having a more established contract. Whereas, Northamptonshire, Lincolnshire, we do quite a lot of work with them as a tertiary referral centre, so we'd have a proper API contract with them. Okay. So that's the bulk of all of these things. now we've got the Q&A bit, so I'll answer the questions as they come up. You can put them in the chat. I'll keep my chat open in a second. The likelihood of change of financial, that they will continually change and evolve these payment systems. So around December, normally around December each year, they kind of put out the planning guidance, which talks about what the payment system is going to be. When they did it last in 2022, they said it was going to be a 2-year thing, so it was going to last till 2025. 2023 anyway. Yeah, in December 2023 they put out planning guidance for 23, 24, 24, 25. So if they find one that works, they might stick with it, but I have a feeling they'll continually evolve in various ways. So these are prepayment. So yeah, so these are prepayment for that. And then, so the aligned payment sense of community provider would probably just be a fixed element. I don't think there's any incentivization for elective work in terms of extra work from them. So whilst it's called an API contract, it probably just has a fixed element, mainly because it's hard to measure activity outside of that. So it'll just be the fixed element based on your previous activity. So it's almost like a block contract for community providers. It's only because in increasingly community providers, there's very few providers that are solely community. Obviously there are a few, but a lot of them have mental health aspects. Some of them, there are increasingly number of acute providers that do some community stuff. So that's probably one of them. Has to go down. Tons of questions. Where were we? Pay performance case of both. So pay performance is so there are certain criteria and pay. So Sequin will for acute providers and mental health and community providers, you have to meet certain targets. So case-based is purely on activity, purely on your what activity you're doing. The performance-based payments are reaching certain criteria. So there'll be certain quality indicators. So about 5-6 years ago, we had one where for in surgery we had to use a particular type of cardiac output monitoring. So it's a device we had to use to monitor during surgery, and if we could show that we use these particular types of monitoring, that we'd get extra money to fund them, because that was the evidence base at the time. So you have to reach. Sometimes it's in some places it's increased access. So you've got to have change your working hours to increase access. There might be something about equality. There's various kind of sequin based things. What can operation managers, leaders do to assist our finance colleagues? It's just work with them. Often they're working with out-of-date data, or they don't fully appreciate the operation side of things. So we've had issues with in my hospital, in my department, where we've had the finances of our staffing doesn't match with our actual staffing. And if you think about and helping them with the negotiations in terms of predicting activity. So if you are expanding your service, make sure all the different aspects of expanding your service are funded, or at least are taken into account. So we've had where we've expanded different services but not thought about the implications outside of our specific area. So they've taken on more surgical in this particular specialty, more surgeons, but haven't actually factored in that they might need more theatre space. So it's about making sure the data is accurate, making sure that when you do your business cases, you factor in all the finances so that there are no hidden costs that come out later. So most business cases are written by operations teams, and so if you can factor in all the different potential costs, that will help underpin the finances rather than having these uncounted finances. That's probably what I meant. Who is responsible for gaps? Oh, that varies depending on the contract. This is where we probably have to ask the question between whoever's the people who are negotiating our contracts, in that we aren't commissioned for that service. Suggests that, is there a service that needs commissioning, and in which case do we need to include it in the contract, and make sure we factor in the payment because it will cost us to deliver that. And you can do that mid-contract potentially, but it's much easier to do it for the next contract. Sometimes some organizations have to absorb a financial hit in order to provide that service, but in most cases, if it's a big service that's vital for a particular area, then or population, then the commissioners you can put forward to do that if it's not being done by somebody else already. So I'm just trying to go through the questions as they come in. How does so UK spending at the moment in Europe is lower, so we don't spend as much as other systems. It's very difficult to say which offers best value because it's measured in different ways. So you can say that America, per capita, per person, they spend much more on health spending than we do, but they have a private system with issues with health insurance and all that kind of stuff. The countries that seem to do well tend to be the ones with lower populations. So the people, the areas that people compare to are the Scandinavian countries, Canada, some of the countries that basically have quite a they have relatively low density populations, and their baseline health, the social side of things is much better developed. So we have relatively high density population in that we have, whilst we do have some rural areas, most of the majority of population lives in very high density areas in the cities, and that has its own issues. France, Germany, they have insurance-based systems. It's national insurance, but it's a different insurance-based system, where they have often they have a mixture of public and private or institutions but they have much smaller centres and over much bigger geography. So it's very hard to compare. If you think about, we highlight there's some of the American systems as being world renowned and offering amazing levels of care, but if you take out the amount of work that's done by even of a mid-sized tertiary hospital, for the amount of money it gets, the outcomes and the volume of activity is much greater in the UK than it is in America. So you can compare, I don't know, some of these big healthcare systems, they have probably 15, 20 hospitals in their healthcare system. We might have 2. They get probably 10 times the amount of funding that our hospital does, but we do more activity for that. So it's very hard to compare, and that's a big piece of work that nobody's really done in a good way in terms of which system does the best, apart from people saying very hard to compare. with the new national tariff coming in, is there move to increasingly develop bundle services? Yes and no. There are the new tariff changes every few years. It can mean different things to different people. Bundle services, in some areas it works to put them together, in some areas it doesn't. So I think if you can combine things together, you want coordinated services rather than necessarily bundled services. You want them to be all work together, but you want to be able to maneuver as well. I agree. If an ICB can roll out a single set of IT systems that are universal across all trusts, it can. That's true. There are some that is I think a lot of places are trying to do that, but it's contract law that's kind of preventing it, because every organization has to change at different times, and so there's always an overlap of issues. Why are SIPs given to providers? Why not just hold on to the money without giving the SIP and asking for it to be returned? Mainly because if you look at how the system works, a lot of, particularly acute sector, a lot of organisations are running over budget, and so the SIP is to try and get you a bit more financially stable and financially sustainable. Because at the moment, even when we're predicting an overspend, we're not meeting our overspend. We're going over our overspend, and you'll find that increasingly you'll get ICS control totals. So the system, so within your integrated care system, you're given a control total that the ICS has to meet, rather than necessarily individual organisations having control totals. So within that, you might get some control totals for the individual organisations. But what was happening previously is that in some areas you had the mental health trust or community trust making money or making a profit, the commissioners either making a profit or not, or breaking even, and then the acute trust making massive losses, which then sent everything into disarray. So the idea is that if they're encouraged to work together by going, look, you need to send some stuff out into the community or do stuff in different ways, work together in a different way to make sure that as a group you are breaking even. And then if we overspend, you basically get a loan from the Department of Health, and then you pay something called public dividend capital on that. So basically interest on those loans. Now there was a process of wiping out a lot of those loans during the early part of the pandemic, or just before that, because a lot of those loans were very, very historic, and so all organisations started afresh. But now we're getting to a point where, again, you're getting this kind of accumulation of loans, which means that you get public dividend capital having to be paid out, which is basically a cost to the organisation. The other thing is that the more financially sustainable you are, the more likely you are to get investment in your services. So both as an individual service, but and an organisation, if you are showing to be financially sustainable, or at least, if you're predicting a £20 million overspend, at least be able to stick to that £20 million overspend, means that you are more likely to get encouraged to be given more funding for different things to develop your services. So tariff prices are determined by, so there's national cost collection. So every organisation puts in or sends in how much it costs to deliver a particular service. So that means that they and ideally this is from your patient level costing systems, which is again one of the talks that you'll come in a bit later on. But they determine how much the costs are for every provider in the country, and they take an average. Okay, so your tariff is based on an average. They take into account of inflation, and they build in an efficiency factor, and then there's a kind of market forces factor that goes in, which, because the cost of equipment might be more certain things might be more in London than it is in other parts of the world, in other parts of the country, but also the cost of delivery of certain equipment might be more in Cornwall because of its rurality than it is in other parts of the country. So there's a market forces factor that's factored into those as well. So then you get this kind of rough average. So if you are losing money on a service, the reason why the kind of the tariffs suggest that you're not doing it as efficiently as you could is because at least half the organizations, or roughly half the organizations of the country, are doing it at either at the same cost or offer better value. So that's where the kind of question is. Wow, lots of questions. Prepayment, what happens when the percentage increase in budget doesn't match the percent increase in activity? It depends in so the payments are, so the elective payments are across the year. So for the variable element is across the year. The fixed element is across the year, but it's fixed, and that's based on historic data. So when if you think your services are increase in size, or your volume of activities are going to increase, you've got to try and predict it and factor that into your negotiations. And you've got to remember that your negotiation may start the December before, or at least the December, if not slightly earlier, before the April financial year starts. So you've got to tell your commissioning teams, look, our activity is going to increase by X amount over in the year for 24-25. We need to factor that into our income, how much we're going to charge for it, because it's part of our acute activity. Or we've taken on extra services. We're now doing this amount of extra stuff because of, we've taken some work from another hospital. Make sure we factor that in. Okay, so you need to make it. That's where that communication comes between you as operations teams and the finance teams who are doing the negotiations on your behalf. So you've got to try and predict that. If you do more activity than acute activity, that in the fixed element, you won't get any more money. That's the whole point of the fixed bit. Okay, that's why you've got to try and predict it. You won't get more money in that year, but you'll get more money the following year, providing you let them know that. Are there income templates to support business case writing so that financial cost benefit analysis can be carried out? I'll talk a bit more about business case writing at the final talk of the series. But what I would say is you need to get your finance teams involved when you're talking about doing your cost benefit analysis, because it really does depend on making sure so you need to use things like Plix teams. So you've got your patient level costing data. So the first thing to do is try and work with your Plix teams to make sure that your data is accurate. And then you can use that to help work out, and you can work with them to work out how your business case any changes you make from your business case will do cost benefit analysis. Okay, so what I'm trying not to do is try and make it so that operations teams do everything independently. You need to work with your finance teams because things will change. How income streams will change. Your individual organizations may have different ways of doing it, or even within your hospital. So, for example, within theatres where I work, our income streams are very different because we get paid on theatre sessions rather than on a number of cases. But obviously the trust income is slightly different, so we have to work it out when we're doing. So increasing activity for us costs us more money than we bring in necessarily. So if we do more cases per lift, that's fine. But if we do more sessions, then we lose money overall. So it depends on exactly how your finances are set up, essentially. Yeah, increased activity does it's better. Things like pathology really struggle, but that's why you have to use link in with your PLIX teams, because they will be able to make sure that's factored in to the cost delivery. So particularly, yeah. So and some diagnostics have separate costs, but they tend to be the radiology based ones. The pathology based ones, yeah, they really struggle in trying to develop services because of the way that your activity is measured. So if you have electronic ordering systems, and you can use that to link it to individual patients and then work out the costs that way. It's a bit more convoluted, but it can be done. But yeah, it does hit diagnostics more.
Hello. You all right?
Hello.
Oh, good. It's okay.
Okay. The home care question about chemotherapy is a bit too specialist for my knowledge. Home care is included in your fixed element, and so you can factor that into your commissioning arrangements. It does depend on how exactly things have been set up. So you probably need to talk about to work out how your individual system is set up, to be honest, to work out whether home care, because obviously that is what you want to do, and it does improve capacity, but you got to make sure that that business case is robust, because it does include it and it is factored in. It's just there are some quirks to the contracts in terms of the high cost chemotherapy drugs and home care delivery, things like that. But that's beyond my specialist area. It's more specialist than my broad knowledge. Would a centralized finance would a centralized finance function work? Generally no, because NHS England they can only deal with the big stuff. If they have to do all the small stuff, you would get some economies of scale, but the cash flows would be immense. And we're talking about billions of pounds. It's very hard to do billions of pounds centrally, for any organisation, private or public. The NHS so play because cash flow. Yeah, cash flow is a massive issue in terms of making sure we pay suppliers. There is a big push within. So another aspect of the One NHS Finance is trying to improve the finance side of things, and it's about making sure payments are paid within days. So we're not getting late fees and charges, but for a lot of organisations, we are overspending so much that our cash flow is not up to scratch. So we have to delay payments just to try and, there are certain budgets and certain cut-offs. So if you can push it into a different month, you can get in different quarters, because it depends on how things are measured. And so sometimes delaying it, and it's worth the extra fees because of the impact it has on your finances for a particular quarter, and how and people's perceptions. So I've been doing this for 7 years now, and all of this is just learned from a lot of the NHS stuff is from reading stuff. I've done a few courses here and there, but yeah, I'm an anaesthetist by mainly. So it costs so much for organisations to be on the supply framework. So the supplier framework. So one of my colleagues, a surgical colleague, they try and do a little bit of activity because they don't get paid to do it as part of the NHS contract, they try and help to drive down the waiting lists by doing it at one of our community hospitals in a private fashion. But it's the same teams. It's just the surgeons are provided because they only get paid 12 PAs. They've already got 12 PAs work, but they're willing to do small cases in the private sector. But it'll cost them probably thousands of pounds to do to get on the provider framework, and the documentation is about hundreds of pages thick, so their time to fill it in. So to get onto the provider framework requires a lot of paperwork and administration, and so that cost is basically passed on. If you're on the provider framework, you're getting NHS activity or any public sector activity, it always costs more. Why do we have provider frameworks? And rather than getting, why can I buy a sofa from DFS, but I can't buy it for my house, but can't buy it for the hospital? There are lots of criteria. There are lots of health and safety issues. There are lots of legal obligations because we're a public sector organisation. So you're in order to meet those criteria, they can. I mean, it's ridiculous that they pay for that there's the knock-on effect that they try and get their money back in other areas. But they want to make a profit as well, so it depends on how it's being done. Some are more transparent than others, but and there's often tax implications and this, that, and the other, which means that it costs more to go to the public sector. And they charge more because they know they won't get paid on time. So they have to factor that in as well. So you might, whilst you get your invoices paid within maybe 10 days, or for example, I try and pay my personal invoices within a couple of days if I can. But if you're not going to get paid for 60 days, you've got to make sure your cash flow is there. There are the problem is that it's so wide and encompassing that it's very hard to differentiate the generic small item stuff from the big purchases. So it's a vicious circle. It ends up being a vicious circle with all of these things, because you end up trying to do it costs them more, so they charge you more, which means then you make it more difficult. And there's lots of the other issue is that there's lots of procurement legislation. So procurement law is a minefield in terms of what you have, all the hoops that have to be jumped through, if particularly for things that might have small individual costs, but because we're buying in such a bulk, it accumulates to, so the contract value is so much. So whilst bottled water individually, I don't know what the latest price is, but you pay £1 for some bottles. If you're buying it for the entire organization, you might then need I don't know, 50, 60,000 or even 100,000, depending on depending how long your contract is. So then that triggers your procurement framework laws, which means you have to go through certain processes. And there are the procurement frameworks, they're trying to simplify them, but they are very, very complicated in terms of which procurement towers. I think one of the talks later on in this series will be on procurement as well, because I think that's a very big area that people need to look at. So that's, I've gone over. Oh my goodness, I wasn't supposed to go over, but there's so many questions I couldn't not. Thank you. We still pay. We still do that OJU, which is the kind of open journal for procurement, because it's still part of the law over a certain value. So until they change the procurement laws, we can't do anything else. That's my bit done. I hope you enjoyed well, I say enjoy. Enjoy might be a bit too much of a push, but I hope you found it informative and interesting and not too dull.